Hi, good evening everybody. Welcome to this evening's Lancaster Psychology Research Showcase talk. Tonight we have Dr Francesca Citron talking about emotion, language and aesthetic perception, the impact of a powerful read. Before I hand you over to Francesca, I'm going to go through a few housekeeping things. So Francesca, if you could just put the first slide up, please. Thanks. So we'll have a half-hour talk followed by 30 minutes of Q&A. Obviously, this is a live talk, so if we have any technical glitches, please just do bear with us. Hopefully everything will run smoothly though. Please post your questions to the Q&A box. You should see the icon there. You can do this at any point during the talk. We'll screen the questions and publish them as they come in, so feel free to do it as and when they come to you. Also, if you particularly like any of the questions that you see in the Q&A, please give them a thumbs up if you'd like to know the answer to them. And we'll try and answer as many questions as we can in the second half of the session. Finally, if you want to turn on the subtitles, you can click on the CC button to do this. But do note that we don't have any control over the subtitles. They are just automatically generated by Microsoft. OK, so I will now hand you over to Francesca.
Good evening, everyone. Thank you for coming to my talk. And so my research interests concern the relation between emotion and language. And in particular, I'm interested in the role of figurative expressions such as metaphors and the role they play in conveying emotion. So when it comes to aesthetic perception or beauty perception, I'll be asking three main questions. So I'll be asking this question first. So what do people experience when they look at something pleasurable or when they read something pleasurable? And to answer this question, I will review neuroscientific research on beauty perception. So we'll see which neural network are activated when we perceive something as beautiful. And these networks will give us insights into what happens when we perceive something as beautiful. And the second question I'm going to ask is what makes literary works beautiful? Okay, so which characteristics of literary works make them beautiful and which effects they have on readers? And then I'll mention a distinction between beauty perception and immersion, which are both important processes when it comes to literary reading. And finally, I'll focus more on metaphors, which is the main focus of my research, and I will review some neural research that we did on metaphors and metaphor comprehension, and then I'll also review some of our research on beauty perception more specifically. Okay. So what do people experience when they look at something beautiful? Well, before we ask this question, we should ask, what is beautiful? Okay, so beauty is something very subjective. So if I show you this painting, do you perceive it as beautiful? Maybe some of you will perceive it as beautiful and some other ones won't like it. So it's something very subjective. And then what about this painting, which is quite an unsettling painting? It may evoke negative emotion, or it shows a scream, so it may evoke fear, or you may get scared. However, some people still enjoy it. They still find it very beautiful. And then we have some more classical works of art that tend to be perceived as beautiful by most people. Okay, so what is beautiful? Empirical research into beauty perception in visual art and statues and so on shows, for example, that facial symmetry or symmetry more general in visual art tends to be associated with higher beauty ratings. And then just to show you an example of one study, bodily proportions are also important. So if I show you these pictures, which one do you find more beautiful? And empirical research showed that this one is perceived as most beautiful because the bodily proportions are all there, whereas in this picture the trunk is much longer than the legs, as you can see, and here is the opposite. So the legs are much longer and the trunk is a bit short. Okay, so this is just one example of empirical research on in visual arts. Okay, so but what do people experience? So as I was mentioning before, neural research give us some important insights. And one of the insights that we get is that when people perceive something as beautiful, they simulate bodily sensations in their own body and in their own brain more specifically. Okay, so if when we look at this statue, for example, we'll start to simulate, to feel part of our body activated, and this it shows up in the brain with a specific activation. So if we cut the brain here, okay, we can obtain this slice, okay, and this portion of the brain is the somatosensory cortex, where we represent touch on our body. And when we see this statue, and if we perceive the statue as particularly beautiful, we tend to simulate more, touch more on our body. And touch is represented in a somatotopic fashion. So this part here, okay, corresponds to this part here. And as you can see, the legs, for example, are represented in this part of the cortex, the gray matter, and then the trunk is represented, and then the hand and the face. And as you can see, the hand is represented in a much larger portion of the cortex, okay, compared to the legs. And the same story is for the face, because hands and face have many neural endings, and they can detect very subtle sensations, as you can imagine. So the representation in the cortex takes much more space, okay, compared to, for example, the legs, or the trunk, the back, and things like that. So that's one of the things we do. When we perceive something as increasingly beautiful, we simulate in our body. And we don't only activate the touch cortex, so the touch, the area of the brain that is associated with touch on our body, which is here, okay, it's the same one that I've just shown you in the previous slide. We also simulate in other cortices, okay. So for example, here we have the scream. This picture may evoke auditory information, so we may find activation in the cortex that is usually active when we hear music, for example, or when we hear someone speaking. Okay, and so we can also activate, depending on the painting or the work of art that we are looking at. We will activate, okay, the visual cortex, of course, and then we can activate the smell areas, the taste areas. So we will activate one or more of the 5 senses. Okay, so this is the simulation that happens. And then a second brain network that we activate when we experience something as increasingly more beautiful is the emotion neural center. Okay, I just simplify things. Obviously, we have a complex network in response to emotion, but I'll simplify things just for the sake of the talk. So, and this suggests that when we see something as beautiful, we get emotionally engaged, okay, involved in the experience. So let's start simple. So when we see a cake, okay, we may have an emotional reaction. Okay, so we desire the cake and we really want to eat it. Okay, and in the same way, when we look at a beautiful statue, we may have some different emotional reactions. You tell me which one. And so, and once again, let's have a look at the negative emotions. So when we see something like that, so a scary bear, we may experience emotions such as fear. Okay, so we start to sweat, our heartbeat goes faster, and things like that. And so, and also another important thing to mention is if we look at the same thing, okay, or if we experience the same thing, different people may react in different ways. So some people may be very happy to go on a roller coaster, and some people may be very scared. Okay, so there's individual differences in emotional responses. But the key story is that all of these emotional reactions are very quickly and very automatically detected by this structure of the brain, which is called amygdala, which means almond because of its almond shape. And this is part of the ancient brain, the ancient mammalian brain. And so this structure reacts every time there's some emotional turmoil. Okay, and so when we perceive something as more and more beautiful, we get pleasure out of it, and the amygdala is activated in response. Okay, so when we see something as beautiful, we simulate sensations in our body, we get involved at the emotional level, and in addition, we also feel rewarded because it's something pleasurable that we are experiencing. And the reward brain circuit is very well known. It has traditionally been studied in rats. So here, you know, the mouse or rat presses a bar, and every time they press this bar, they get some food. Okay, and so obviously some electrodes were implanted in the mouse brain, which is not very nice for the mouse. And so the reward circuit could be localized through this experimental paradigm. And nowadays we are very familiar with the reward circuit in the human brain as well, which is located in the coded nucleus, which is also at the base of our brain. Okay, so here is the amygdala that we saw before, and this is the coded nucleus, which looks like a pair of glasses. Okay, we always have, you know, two coded nuclei, two amygdalae in the two different hemispheres, as you can see. And so when we perceive something as increasingly beautiful, such as a painting and so on, the reward circuit gets activated. And not only in visual art, but also in literary art. Okay, so there is a study in particular, but many more, by Born et al., where they showed Proverbs, and I'm going to get back to Proverbs, but imagine they showed literary text, small, short literary text, and they found that the more beautiful readers were finding the stimuli, the more the coded nucleus was activated. So it's here, okay? Whereas this one is the anterior cingulate cortex, so it's a different area, but part of the emotion neural network. So this is coded nucleus, so reward. Why am I talking about Proverbs? Well, in experiments, we often need to have very simple stimuli, and we need to have many different stimuli, and we need to control over their properties. So one easy way to do it is to use, you know, short sentences. And so these authors consider that proverbs, which are, let's say, creative expressions, okay, that were successful and therefore they survived over the years and they were transmitted over the centuries, okay. Proverbs can be considered the minimal unit of literary text. Okay, so instead of taking a poem or a long story, they just took poems as an approximation. Okay, but we will see many other studies that used different types of stimuli. Okay, so let's move on. Now, what is it that makes literary works beautiful? First of all, what do we mean by literary works? Just in a nutshell, we include poems, novels, fiction books, okay, anything you're very familiar with. So basically all the things that you read in order to take pleasure out of them, okay, pleasurable reading, no matter whether it is sad or happy. And so which characteristics of literary works make them beautiful? Well, I would say overall stylistic devices. And I'm going to give you some examples. You're very familiar with that, even though you may not remember what it means. So this is an example of a poem, Drum Dream Girl. So I'll try to read it. So on an island of music in a city of drumbeat, the drum dream girl dreamed. Okay, so here we've got a repetition of this consonant, the D, which is called repetition or alliteration. And this is an example of, you know, stylistic device where sound is used and there is a sound play going on. Okay, let's have a look at some more of this poem. Of pounding tall conga drums, tapping small bongo drums, and boom, boom, booming with long, loud sticks. Okay, so here we've got rhythm or meter. So there's a rhythm, a clear, you know, stress pattern that makes it musical. Okay, so this is another type of stylistic device or sound play. Okay, and then once again alliteration, so repetition of the initial consonant. Okay, so I'm sure you all studied this in school at some point. And then we've got exaggeration or hyperbole is also called. I was so hungry I could eat an elephant. So wow, so much you could eat. The bug weighed a ton. And then if we look at poetry, she scorched you with her radiance. So, you know, an exaggeration once again. And finally, guess what? Metaphor. So metaphor obviously is also a stylistic device. It doesn't play with sound, it plays with meaning. And metaphors are considered mappings between abstract, difficult concepts and more concrete concepts that rely on one of the five senses. So for example, she had a rough day. Here we use rough texture, so touch, in order to conceptualize difficulty, which is an abstract concept. Okay, so to simplify and make things easier to grasp, just use a metaphor. So here we've got bitter taste to represent something bad. And then if we look at poetry, Juliet is the sun. Well, this is a creative metaphor, it's a novel metaphor, so it's not a conventional expression. So we won't know what the writer exactly wanted to say. So it may be that they used light to represent beauty, or sun to represent resourcefulness, or being in the sun as bringing happiness. We don't know because it's novel. Okay. So, but what is it that stylistic devices actually do? Well, stylistic devices foreground. They bring things to the fore. They make things stand out. Okay, and so in other words, they make things more complex, less familiar. They prolong the reading experience. They they make readers. They expose readers to the literary materials for a longer time, okay, because they create complexity and unfamiliarity, so to say. And as a result of this, as a result of being exposed for a longer time to these texts, readers get pleasure out of it. Okay, so stylistic devices complicate things in order to evoke more pleasure, because readers spend more time with the text. Okay. And so there is empirical research, once again, that shows, this is from the Max Planck Institute for Empirical Aesthetics in Frankfurt, that shows that if we take original poems and we strip them of their stylistic devices, so alliteration, exaggeration, all the things that we saw earlier. So if we remove those stylistic devices, these very poems become easier to read. However, they are also perceived as less beautiful. Okay, so complexity and beauty tend to go together. This is an example from our research where we took poems that had metaphors and we changed them. So we had, you know, the same poem, but we replaced each metaphor with the literal counterpart. Okay, and we found that participants rated the original metaphorical poems as more beautiful. Okay, so it's so while previous research showed this with stylistic devices that play with sound, we showed this with metaphors, so a stylistic device that plays with meaning. Okay, so for foreground to be effective and to elicit pleasure, it needs background. In other words, if you want something to stand out, they need to stand out against the background. Okay, so what is background? Background in literary text usually consists of descriptions of familiar situations, social and historical contexts that are familiar to the readers, recurrent literary themes, and the aim of background is basically to make things familiar, to make reading flow, to make reading the reading experience fluent, and in turn to immerse the reader into the story world. So if reading is easy and fluent, then readers get into the story world, get transported into the story more easily. Okay, therefore, novels and fiction books and so on tend to be more immersive than poems because they contain much more background, whereas poems tend to contain many foregrounding elements. Okay, so it's more difficult to read poems. Okay, and so there is this, I give you an example of background versus foreground just to make it a bit more concrete. So if we read this story, Barbara had worked behind the bar at the White Bull for over 20 years. She had a large amount of knowledge on how the pub was managed, what the local punters drank, and all the other staff really liked her. Okay, so background, we're describing something, you know, that is quite a familiar context where we're familiar with the pubs and what happens there, and etc. And then we've got She wasn't the manager, but she certainly called the shots, which everyone respected. So here we've got something a little bit unexpected that contrasts with the background. And guess what? An idiomatic expression, so a figurative expression, has been used to create the to make things stand out. Okay, so it's just an example of background versus foreground. And then importantly, for foreground to be effective, so to elicit beauty perception, it needs to be optimally innovative. So there is theoretical and empirical research showing that if we create a novel expression based on a familiar one, we obtain optimal innovation, and this will elicit most pleasure, most beauty perception, the highest beauty perception. So, for example, a piece of paper is a common expression, familiar expression that we use in daily communication. And if we change it in this way, a single piece of paper, we're just changing it slightly. So the meaning is still there, it's still the same thing, but we are actually specifying it more. So it's not a big innovation, okay? It's almost like, you know, changing something slightly. And then if we change it more, then we have a piece of paper. So peace will be as in peace and love. So here something, you know, something novel is coming and it builds on something familiar. And this is considered optimal innovation. So people will find this type of variation or creation most beautiful. And if we have a full innovation, so a pill of pepper, then beauty won't be as high because there's nothing familiar to build on. So it's completely new. And so this idea came from Giora, who came up with this theory and conducted empirical evidence. But we can look at more empirical work from other labs where something similar has been found. So once again, we go back to Born et al. This is a different study, but still from her, from them, where they used German proverbs just to, you know, simplify things. The one who dares wins, all roads lead to Rome. Okay, I've just translated them into English to simplify. And then they defamiliarized the proverbs and created unfamiliar versions. The one who risks wins, all paths lead to Rome. So here the meaning and the content is preserved, but the wording has been changed. And then they created variants where they changed the meaning. The one who asks wins. All sins lead to Rome instead of all roads. So the meaning is different. And let's see what they found. So they measured brain activity while people read these proverbs, and they found that all unfamiliar proverbs, so both variants and substitutions, activated the reading brain network more strongly compared to familiar proverbs. So the pink areas represent the reading network in the brain, okay, which is more strongly activated for unfamiliar minus familiar proverbs. Whereas in the opposite contrast, when the brain activity in response to familiar, we take the brain activity in response to familiar proverbs and we subtract the brain activity in response to unfamiliar proverbs, okay, and we find this yellow areas. So familiar proverbs activated a network which is associated with doing nothing. So when we are not reading, we're waiting for the next sentence to come up. We are waiting, so we have nothing to do. We just look at the screen and wait for the next sentence to read. So in those moments, our mind starts to wander, okay, mind wandering. And so this network was more activated for familiar proverbs because they're easier to process, so we need less effort, okay, if compared with unfamiliar ones. So far so good, but what about these variations? So the proverb variants where the meaning was changed, so the one who asks wins, engage the emotion neural network, so all these red areas, okay, and so let's say this may be considered optimal innovation, okay, so there's something familiar and something novel, the meaning has changed and participants get emotionally engaged, so they probably find these variations quite interesting. However, when we look at proverb substitutions, where the meaning is the same but the wording has changed, these were actually perceived as mistakes. So these activated the error detection network and attention network, so in the blue areas. So as if, as if these expressions were perceived as wrong, because no, the proverb is something else, and this is not the right wording, even though it means the same. So yes, so to sum up all of this research, in order to immerse readers, we need familiar elements, so we need background. But then in order to surprise the reader, we need novel elements, okay, that will evoke interest and engagement with the text. And then foregrounding elements will evoke maximum pleasure and, highest beauty ratings if they are optimally innovative. And now let's move on to the last bit, which is about metaphors. Okay, so just to remind you, here we've got examples of metaphors where the different senses are used. So he's a sweet guy. We use taste to say to represent sweet taste, to represent kindness. She's one of the brightest students. Here we use vision. Here we use touch again. I was very moved at their wedding, so motion, and then I hear you, I understand you. We use the hearing domain. So our research was able to show that when we read metaphorical formulations, we get stronger amygdala activation, so the emotion center, compared to when we read their literal counterparts. So let's have a look at examples of stimuli. So we use the taste metaphors in a first study. She received a sweet compliment versus she received a kind compliment. So as you can see, these are just two examples. We had about 37 different sentences, so 37 pairs. The two types of sentences, the two versions are almost identical and the meaning is highly similar, but they differ for one word, which is metaphorical versus literal. And these two types of sentences were, we also made sure that they contained the same amount of emotional information, they were perceived as equally familiar, and they were both equally easy to imagine, okay, so that we don't have any confounding factors. And we asked participants to silently read for comprehension while we recorded their brain activity. And what did we find? So when we take the brain activity in response to metaphors and we subtract the brain activity in response to literal sentences, we found, first of all, that the taste areas were activated. So the areas that, the brain areas that are activated when we eat food, taste food, were recruited, at least in part, in order to understand taste-related metaphors, which means that even though taste metaphors convey an abstract meaning, so sweet guy would be, kind person, kind guy, kind person, kind girl. So even though the meaning is abstract and is kind, this meaning gets represented partially in the taste area, so in the cortices that we use for perception. And we obtained similar results with smell metaphors, which also activated smell-related areas. But most importantly, what I've already mentioned is that we found this left amygdala activation and also activation of the hippocampus in response to metaphorical formulations compared to literal ones. So the amygdala is the emotion center, and you can see it all here. And then we also have part of the hippocampus, which is associated with memory. Okay. And so we interpreted this finding as stronger emotional engagement in response to metaphorical formulations. We replicated this very finding of stronger engagement using different types of stimuli, so different metaphors that are not restricted to taste. We use natural stories instead of single sentences. We use sentences with no emotive content, devoid of any emotion. We tested second language speakers and we generalized this finding to idioms, so a different type of figurative expression. We also find similar support from other studies. So there's a meta-analysis of 23 neuroimaging studies from different labs that showed left amygdala activation overall consistently there for figurative versus literal expressions. There's some other research by Foreground et al. Where they also found amygdala. And then Metaphors also evoke stronger physiological reactions, such as heart rate responses, compared to their literal counterparts. But what about beauty? So far we've looked at conventional metaphors. Okay, so she's a sweet girl, that was a bitter breakup. These are very conventional metaphors that we use in everyday language. But in literary work, we use, more creative and novel metaphors tend to be used, such as Juliet is the sun. Okay, so what happens with beauty and metaphors? We collected about, we gathered about 90 to 93 sentences taken from poems or put together by us. And we looked at, so the sentences were poetic-like, but they could be literal or metaphorical to different extents. So this is an example of literal phrase. I am not a bad person, I am kind. And then we've got, I'm bored of your superficial reaction, which nowadays native speakers don't even think is a metaphor because it's so common that it's basically dead. Okay, so superficial means something like shallow. So there is some metaphor there, if you see what I mean. But it's basically no longer considered even metaphorical. Whereas conventional metaphors, okay, so she brought joy with her bubbly personality. Here, every native speaker would say, oh yes, bubbly is definitely a metaphor, okay, but it's a conventional metaphor, so everyone knows what it means, there's no doubt. And then we had novel metaphors. So a broken heart is a shattered mirror reflecting life in pieces. So this is not a common expression, but still, if you try and understand what it may mean, it's okay. I mean, it kind of makes sense. And then we had extremely novel metaphors. I am not street meat, I am homemade jam. Okay, so here is really like, what exactly does the writer want to say with that? So it's, more tricky to come up with a possible meaning. What did we do with all these nice sentences? We collected ratings on scales from participants for the level of metaphoricity. How metaphorical do you think this is on a scale? How familiar, how easy it is to imagine, and how beautiful. So what did we find? So here we've got the literal sentences, dead metaphors, conventional, novel, extremely novel. Metaphoricity goes up, so literal sentences are not at all metaphorical. Dead metaphors, a bit. And then conventional metaphors are clearly metaphorical, but then novel and extremely novel metaphors are even more metaphorical. And familiarity goes down. The more novel, the more metaphorical, the less familiar, which makes sense. And then we looked at imageability as well, and there were no big differences. So people could easily imagine all of these sentences. Obviously, for novel and extremely novel metaphors, that was a little bit less easy because you need to try and work out what it means. So it's difficult to imagine something that, that you're not sure about what meaning it has. But still, they could imagine quite well. Okay, so the scale is 1 to 7. So here we are over 4. But yeah, so imageability didn't play a big role, which is good because then it's no big confounding factor in our study. But then what about beauty? Beauty increased as metaphoricity increased, which is good news. So metaphors consist in a stylistic device, and the more creative and novel they are, the more beautiful they are perceived. So this is good news. I mean, it may sound obvious, but we didn't know of anyone who had done this before, so we did it. And so let's have a look at this a bit more in detail. So these are the actual data points. So we can see that, in blue, we have the literal sentences, which tend to be, less beautiful. And then we've got in green and brownish, we have dead metaphors and conventional metaphors. And then purple and yellow, which are the novel and extremely novel metaphors, tend to go up in beauty. Okay, so there seems to be a linear relationship between metaphoricity, how metaphorical they are, and how beautiful they are. Okay, however, if you look at this picture, so this is in the 5 categories instead of being the single data point, we see a little bit of a drop here for extremely novel metaphors, which may be particularly tricky to process and to make sense out of. So we thought maybe we can find some kind of quadratic relationship here where beauty goes up and then goes down. And so in our multiple regression, we found that the linear term was definitely significant, but then on top of the linear term, the quadratic term was also able to explain some additional variance after the linear term had been entered, which means, yes, there tends to be a positive relationship. So the more metaphorical, the more beautiful. But at some point, if metaphors become too novel and too complex to process, then beauty tends to go slightly down. Okay, and finally, we also measured natural reading times, and so we found that the more metaphorical, the more the longer the reading times. Okay, which makes perfect sense. And so what we can, let's say, conclude from all of this is that first, metaphors engage readers more strongly at the emotional level. The more novel a metaphor, the more it is perceived as beautiful. But also, on top of beauty, complexity and difficulty also increase with increasing metaphoricity. Okay, and so when metaphors become too novel and too difficult to process, beauty will eventually also decrease. Okay, and so this reminds us of the optimal level of innovation that is needed to elicit most pleasure. Thank you.
Thank you, Francesca, for a fascinating talk. We have one question already from the audience, but just to remind you, if you want to ask Francesca anything, please do post your questions in the Q&A or give any questions that you like a thumbs up and we'll read them out. So first question, Francesca. Someone has asked, is the idea of foreground and background generally known to writers, and do good writers use the strategy of contrast deliberately?
Okay, so yes, I think nowadays writers will be aware of the difference between foregrounding and backgrounding. They may not have been aware of these labels back then, before they were invented, but I think, so a couple of centuries ago, maybe people hadn't yet come up with these labels, foreground and background. Okay, so these are literary scholars that came up with these things, and it's literary scholars that came up with these names like, you know, alliteration, hyperbole, exaggeration. So it's literary scholars that have classified everything into you know, a taxonomy. Okay, so poets may not have been aware of the taxonomy back then, but they were certainly playing around with sounds, with meaning, with, okay, we call them figures of speech, so with images and sensory information on purpose. Okay, so they definitely use these things on purpose and put them there. So it's not by accident that, you know, different stanzas have a pattern of rhyme, for example. Well, rhyme is not something that I mentioned. So it's not by accident that we find these patterns in poetry. So they definitely use them on purpose. Yes, I'm not sure I answered your question, Pa.
Thanks. So kind of following on from that, I was wondering, so you've talked a lot about different ways that writing can be made beautiful. Could you potentially create some kind of formula for writing something beautiful? Is this something that writers could use, for example, in their writing? Yeah. Yeah,
that's a good question. Well, yeah, so actually I gave a similar talk at the conference where it was like the Romantic Novelist Conference. So it was a conference where writers were interested in this work. And obviously, you know, I can't give tips to writers, to authors of fiction books, of course, but they found these findings quite insightful. So one idea is that, you know, if you're writing a story and you want to engage readers, if you start to use too many metaphors and, you know, too creative ones, eventually you lose the reader. So it's good to, you know, have this fluent reading experience, make it easy, and then surprise the reader every now and then with a metaphor or a stylistic device or a surprise effect, but not too much, because too much surprise and too strong effects in the long run may render reading difficult, actually. But obviously, you know, I don't feel like giving advice to to actual writers. But it's one of the insights that we could get out of this empirical research.
Definitely, and yeah, it could potentially be translated into, you know, creative writing courses and that kind of thing. Feedback into that.
Definitely, yeah.
So another question from the audience. Someone has asked, are you aware of any cross-cultural differences in the perception of beauty?
That's a very big question. So now, in terms of literary reading, I am not aware of some empirical research, but I believe there will be differences. So, you know, when I was talking about background, so obviously, you know, readers from a certain culture, from a certain nationality, will be more familiar with certain scenarios, with certain, you know, think about food and food habits, or, you know, hobbies and things like that. Obviously, in a certain geographical place or country or, you know, cultural group, let's say, there will be things that are more familiar to that group. So depending on, you know, who the fiction book has been written for, you know, it may be more engaging and easier to read for readers from that cultural background, and it may be more tricky to read even in a different language to people who come from a very different cultural background. So there will definitely be you know, differences in that sense. This is with regards to literary works. And then, of course, I mean, when it comes to beauty more generally, you can only imagine, you know, so the standards of beauty are very, very different in the different cultures, if you think of it. And we know that, you know, they change across centuries. If you look at the paintings and, you know, these beautiful women, what was a beautiful woman, how, you know, what was considered a beautiful woman a couple of centuries ago and what is it now? Obviously, you know, it's very, very different. Yeah. I don't know if I answered the question.
So kind of related to that, so you've talked a lot about how beauty is subjective, but also that there might be individual differences and in relating to cross-cultural differences as well. Do you know of any reasons why some people may experience some things as more beautiful than others? So, for example, is it differences in their emotional reactions, do you think?
Well, I'm not sure. I mean, what is beautiful for me or for someone else depends on many different things. So values, interest, education, the way they were raised, what their interests are, so it's very, very different. So I would say anything could have an effect.
Okay.
Yeah.
Wide range of reasons.
Yeah. So the key thing is that when we do empirical research, it's very difficult to generalize over a group of participants because each participant will perceive beauty differently. So a lot of empirical research that has been done in the field, maybe more with visual art, but I think even with literary texts, tends to you know, they collect beauty ratings from the single participants and then they correlate, you know, the brain activity or the reading times or the physiological responses. They correlate them to the ratings of the single participant, so to say, instead of, you know, having a big, you know, a big pot, put everything in together and say, okay, the average beauty ratings is from all the participants is higher for this stimuli compared to the other ones, let's compare them. So with this empirical research, they really try to look at beauty from the perspective of the single participant and then looking into the brain, if that makes some sense.
Yeah, it does. So we have a couple more questions from the audience. Someone has asked, does the rating for beauty in poetry differ when people read quietly compared to when they read out loud?
Okay, that's a good question. So I guess it depends on why they read out loud. So if they read out loud, you know, for themselves, maybe we would find similar effects. If they read out loud for some other people, then we may find some we may find some inhibition of the emotional responses, because obviously, you know, if I'm reading for an audience, I'm concentrated on my performance. So if you think about, when you learn to read as a child, and well, at least when I was young, when I was a child, our teacher would ask us to read aloud in front of everyone. Okay, so then the main worry of the child was, I need to read well. Okay, so they may not have understood a word of what they were reading. So it depends on why they read aloud. And the reason why we had them read silently in our experiments was very simple. They were in the scanner, so we were recording brain activity. So any reading out loud would mean mouth movement and possibly, reverberation into the head and the neck. And we don't want to have head movements while we record brain activity. So as easy as that. Yeah.
Okay. Another question, do you get different degrees of emotional response to text that is written in one's first compared to second language?
Very good question. So the literature is mixed. So we think that, yes, if you read a story, for example, a biography or something described in the first person, you are going to get more immersed, more engaged than if it's narrated in the third person. Okay. However, there's not enough research out there. And the studies that are out there, some of them showed what I've just mentioned, and some other ones showed conflicting evidence. So they show no difference between first and third person. So this is exactly something that we need to investigate, that needs to be investigated further. Yeah, so it's an interesting avenue. Yeah.
Okay. Another question is, why do we get more emotional response to beautiful things? Is our brain trying to protect us from ugly things?
Okay, so beauty doesn't necessarily mean positive. Okay, so for example, sad music or scary music can actually be, let's talk about sad music first, because there's plenty of research out there. So sad music that makes you, feel depressed and longing and all of this. Actually, people appreciate this, so they listen to it because they get pleasure out of it. So this beauty perception and pleasure may not necessarily be associated with, something positive. It may be something negative, but this empathetic thing resonating with feelings that are evoked by the music evokes pleasure in us. And then, yeah, so just to clarify, and then the ugly part is difficult. So I guess, if something is not beautiful in our view, then we don't get pleasure out of it, so we avoid it. But we don't necessarily feel bad emotions about it unless it's really disgusting, you know what I mean? And disgust is definitely not something that we would associate with pleasure. But, high activation, high arousal or sadness while we listen to music can be associated with pleasure. So it's a bit of a tricky, complex picture.
Okay. Another question, why do proverb variants engage the emotional neural network more so than the reading brain network?
Okay, so all the unfamiliar proverbs that were used engage the reading network more strongly than the familiar proverbs. Okay, so both the proverb variants and the proverb substitutions were both more difficult to process, and therefore the reading network was more strongly activated, okay, compared to familiar proverbs. But then when we look specifically at the proverb variants, okay, on top of the reading network, they also activated the emotion network more strongly than, say, familiar proverbs, because there was something novel in them that people found interesting. Okay, the one who asks wins is an innovation. Oh, it's not the one who dares, it's the one who asks. Actually, by asking, I can also win. Okay, so you've got to think about it to make sense out of it. And so that probably was perceived as interesting, and therefore people got emotionally engaged as well. So it's an interesting creation. Okay, whereas in the proverb substitutions, the meaning was exactly that. And we know that, proverbs are specific expressions that cannot be changed. So you can say, well, now I can't think of any proverbs, but so you can only say all roads lead to Rome. You can't say differently because proverbs are, chunks. You have to use those very words and not different ones. So if you want to convey the same meaning, but you change a word, it's like, well, that's not the proverb. That's not how you say it. Okay, so that's what we tend to do as native speakers. I mean, I'm not a native speaker of English, but we tend to conform. We tend to find the conventional expression, and this makes sense to us. And if the conventional expression is modified into something that is not the conventional expression, it's like, no, that's not how you say that. And so they perceive this as a mistake. So they didn't perceive it as an innovation. It's like, oh, interesting to say it the other way, because the meaning is the same, the content is the same, it's just a different word, which is not the usual one, if that makes sense.
Okay, yeah, it does.
Sorry, I'm talking.
That's okay. So we have time for a couple more questions, if anyone wants to post any others. In the meantime, I would like to ask, have you ever compared the styles of different writers? So, for example, can you identify any particular writers that have a particularly beautiful style according to what you found in your research?
Yeah, that's a very interesting thing. So, no, I haven't. And that would be really interesting. That would be really interesting. So, so it would be interesting, two things. Yeah, to compare different writers. I mean, I for example, Hemingway, I love Hemingway, but he could be a bit boring sometimes, a bit like, repetitive. So that would be interesting to see, different writing styles. But going back to the culture story, that's what I would be interested in. So to see whether a certain story that fits a culture very well would be perceived, how would it be perceived by someone from a different culture? Supposing that we are delivering the story in a language that the speakers are familiar with, so in their native language. But if a story is culture specific, how is it going to be perceived by someone who's an outsider? Is it gonna be interesting? Is it gonna be, ambiguous, and it wouldn't make sense? So that's something that I would like to investigate in future.
That would be really interesting. Okay, so we don't have any other questions. You've mentioned briefly that you do work using fMRI, using functional MRI, I should say. Could you briefly tell us a little bit about that? What's it like working with it? What's it like for your participants, for example?
Yes, so fMRI is a bit of a tricky thing. So it's a wonderful method because obviously it gives us hints, it gives us insights on what happens while we are processing something. So if you think about reading times, they only tell us something about the result of the reading. So how long does it take you to read a sentence? Okay, so we only know it tells us something about the outcome of the reading process. Whereas by looking into the brain, we can infer something. About what's happening as we read, so during the reading process. And with fMRI in particular, because we can locate specific areas of the brain, and because we know from previous research more or less which functions are associated with those areas, we can draw inferences of about what happens in the brain. So, the reward circuit was mapped because of some other reasons, and the reward was thought, but we can see that the same, ancient network that responds to, rewarding food is also there when we also reuse it when the reward is something more abstract, so more pleasurable, such as a painting or literary reading. So yeah, so that's the advantage of fMRI. Of course, in terms of implementation, fMRI is quite an expensive technique, and also running an experiment is quite demanding because so you need you need to design an experiment. You need participants to read or do a task in a situation in which they may not feel as comfortable, so they're not sitting at a desk, but they're lying into a scanner, and the scanner is noisy, so they have earplugs, and then they have, so it can be quite unpleasant, and so obviously participants that have experience as fMRI participants are going to feel more comfortable. So yeah, it's quite a lot of work, and then when you have the data, you know, it's not like reading times. There's a lot of pre-processing steps that you need to do to clean the data, align the brain activations with the map of the single participant's brain. So it's quite, you know, it takes, you know, about a full year to run one single experiment and get some results. So yeah, but it's worth it.
A lot of work, but very interesting. We have a couple more quick questions before we finish. So someone has asked, have you looked at how dialogue in film does or doesn't give satisfaction?
Okay, no, I haven't, and I don't know about this, but I know of research where, okay, this is a bit different. I know of research where they analyzed film reviews, and they try to, so these are colleagues of mine, I mean, in a different university. So they're linguists, so they try to identify creative uses of metaphors within film reviews. Sorry, I mean, I'm not answering your question, I've just realized, but that's all I know of. And so that was interesting because, so it would be interesting to see in everyday expression, you know, actual speakers of the language, what they come up with when they're trying to express something. And in particular, you know, there is evidence showing that when people talk about their emotional states, so they describe autobiographical events that were, and they focus on how they felt in response to these events, there is evidence showing that they use more metaphorical expressions compared to when they describe the same event, but by describing what happened rather than how they felt. So there is evidence showing that when people talk about their emotions, they tend to use more metaphors to make things, you know, more easy to imagine, more engaging, and so on. And so film dialogues and stuff may be quite rich materials. Yeah, so that's all I know. Sorry, I just drifted out.
That's great, thanks. Final question, why do metaphors activate the taste areas and the anterior left hippocampus? So I guess this is referring back to your metaphor study. Yeah.
So yeah, I didn't go into too much detail, but basically one of the reasons why we studied metaphors is that so metaphors allow us to investigate how abstract meaning is processed. Okay, so if we think about cake, I talk about cake, or you read something about, you know, I ate a lovely strawberry cake today. If you read this, your taste area in the brain will partially be activated. So your language network will be activated, but also part of the meaning representation of cake recruits taste areas. Okay. But cake is something concrete that we can eat and taste. So it's very easy to represent the meaning by using taste areas because it's a concrete concept. When we have abstract concepts, for example, thought, consideration, you know, these very abstract, complex words, where do we represent them in the brain? It's unclear, you know. Yeah, we represent them in the language network, but you know, is it just abstract symbols? How can we, you know, keep the stuff in mind, you know, just by using words? You know, it's very difficult. And so one way to investigate how we represent abstract meaning in the brain is by using metaphors, because they are a bridge between abstract and concrete concepts. And so we found that even highly conventional metaphors, so when I say she's a sweet girl, you don't think about sugar, you don't think about sweet taste, you just think about kindness or cuteness or, you know, niceness or whatever it is, you know. So when you understand conventional metaphors, you grab the meaning immediately. You don't get caught up with, oh, she said sweet, oh, she said bitter, you know. So you just get to the point. So you're still understanding the abstract meaning, but even that, for that abstract meaning representation, you still recruit some of the sensory stuff that is used by metaphors. I hope I haven't made it too complicated.
I think that was nice and clear. Thank you, Francesca. I think we'll have to
Yeah.
I think we've gone through all the questions, so we can wrap things up there. The next talk, next up in the series next week, we have Dr. Marina Bajidai talking about I don't know, but I know who to ask, how babies seek information from others. So please join us at the same time again next week. And in the meantime, you can follow us on the web, on Twitter and on YouTube. Thanks very much. Thanks very much for listening. And thank you so much, Francesca, for a wonderful talk and question session.
Thank you, Bryony. Thank you, everyone, for coming and asking questions. Thank you.
Thank you. Have a lovely evening.